with this. So that's the announcements. And now today what we're going to do is we're going to finish our discussion of phonological awareness, and we're going to start talking about English morphology. And we just have to wait for the display to start up. But what we're going to do is look at why it's important to understand phonology and phonological awareness. We spent time last class discussing phonological awareness, what it is, how it develops, the sequence for development, what's easier, what's harder. But what we're really interested in now is what's the purpose of looking at this? Why is it such a big buzzword? And the key thing is in reading disabilities and reading acquisition. And that we find that through phonological awareness, we can prevent a lot of the reading disabilities. After we finish up our discussion of phonological awareness, we're going to get into morphology. And the reason why morphology is so important, particularly with English, is that English's writing system is morphophonemic. In other words, it reflects both the morphology of the words and the spelling reflects both the morphology of the words as well as the phonology or the sound structure of the words. So, for example, words like nation and national, even though it has different pronunciations, it preserves the spelling for nation, even though the pronunciation changes for national, and that reflects the meaning of the words. So we're going to be looking at morphology today, and we're going to be discussing morphology in greater depth on Thursday. So there's been a lot of research looking at phonological awareness, and starting in the 1970s, Don Shankweiler and his group did some sort of breakthrough work in looking at rhyming and looking at finding that individuals who were typically achieving, normally developing, typical reading skills, when you give them lists of words, of letters to remember, like A, K, J, when the letters rhyme with each other, then what you found is that a lot of normal readers made a lot of mistakes. They made a lot of confusions. But the kids with the adults, the kids with reading disabilities, what he found was that they seemed to be totally insensitive to the rhyming patterns. And that when the lists didn't rhyme, that he found that there was no difference for the reading disabled adults and kids with the lists that rhymed and didn't rhyme. But for the typically achieving, what we found is that their performance was impaired on the lists that rhymed, but not the ones that didn't rhyme. And that sort of led to the whole field to looking at, oh wow, rhyming and phonology seems to be something important. Since then, there's been a ton of research, and one of the things that we find cross-linguistically, cross-culturally, is that deficits in phonological awareness, difficulties in processing the phonology of a language. Doesn't matter what the language is, whether it's an alphabetic language, whether it's a syllabic language, what we find is that individuals with reading disabilities all have deficits in phonological awareness. So it seems to be universal. It's not language specific. It's not just English. And a number of different paradigms have been used. One is called the reading level match. And with the reading level match, what you do is you take a bunch of kids, say fifth graders, and if you compare the fifth graders with reading disabilities to the ones without reading disabilities, what we find is that the kids with reading disabilities do badly on like a huge range of skills. They do poorly with phonological processing, they do poorly with spelling, they tend to show limited vocabulary, they tend to show grammatical issues, and we find that it's like across the board there are these issues. And so it's not very discriminatory. We don't know, is this a function of their reading skill, or is it a result of the reading disability? So then there's been some really clever work done looking at what we call a reading level match. You take the fifth graders with reading disabilities, and you look, say that the reading disabled fifth graders are all reading at a second grade level. You compare the reading disabled kids who are at fifth grade, reading at a second grade level, to typically achieving second graders. So what you do is you match the reading skill of the disabled readers to typically achieving younger children. And the idea is, well, let's look. If the older fifth graders perform the same way as second graders who are typically achieving, matched on reading ability, on all the skills, then we could say, okay, well, this is what's normal when you're reading at a second grade level. So it's kind of like a lag at slower development. But if you see that the older kids do more poorly than the second graders on any of the skills, then you'd say, wow, this is something that that the older kids with reading disabilities, they get to their reading level, the second grade reading level, using completely different strategies, or possibly different strategies than the typically achieving, typical development. And what we find is that when in studies matching older individuals with reading disabilities to typically achieving children matched on reading level, we find that they do more poorly on phonological awareness. So it seems to be that, okay, we expect older kids to do as well or better than younger children on a variety of skills. So when they do more poorly, that's a sign that there's a deficit. And so the reading level match design seems to suggest that phonological awareness is really critical. There are other approaches. Dick Olson in Colorado, in Boulder, with his group, they've got this massive twin study going. And one of the things that they've been investigating primarily has been with reading development. And what they do is they look at identical twins and fraternal twins. So monozygotic twins and dizygotic twins. And what they do is they look to see how heritable a skill is. So what they do typically is they pick the child with the twin with the weaker reading disability, the weaker reading skills for the reading disabled. And they look to see how much, so with the twin one, what we've seen is if this is average reading skill, what we want to see is with the first twin, looking at their reading skills, we expect that there be something known as regression to the mean. How many of you have heard the term regression to the mean before? Okay, so regression to the mean is basically if you have a really extreme score, just chances are the next one will be a little closer. So that if you, if you have a really tall parent, chances are, like a 6'7" parent, odds are, if it's totally random, that their child will be a little shorter. So we'd expect that it wouldn't be as extreme. And that's known as regression to the mean. What we find is that in looking at the twins, we want to see how much it's random and how much it isn't random. If it's heritable, then we would expect the second twin, so the twin one is orange, twin two, or the co-twin, we'll do in green. Because we always pick the first twin as the one with the weaker skills, and the co-twin as the one with the stronger skills, if we find something's very heritable, we would find that their scores would be very similar. And if it's not heritable, if it has a huge environmental influence, we would find it to be pretty random about its relationship. And what Dick Olson has found is that we find that there's a huge heritability factor in terms of phonological awareness. So if we find that one twin has a reading disability and very poor phonological awareness scores, we find that the co-twin tends to have those weaker scores, that there seems to be a very strong genetic component involved with phonological awareness. Okay, does that make sense to you, the twin studies? Okay. So we have that suggests phonological awareness. Now, one of the things that seems to be very strong in terms of evidence is also the training studies. what happens if we train a child's phonological awareness? Do we find change? If we think that phonological awareness, poor phonological awareness, plays a causal role in reading disabilities, then the idea is if we train a child's phonological awareness, then they would learn to read more easily, and that it would diminish the reading difficulties they have. And there seems to be quite a bit of evidence that phonological awareness training, coupled with phonics instruction, leads to improvements in reading. In fact, there have been some fMRI studies done, the Haskins group on the East Coast. What they found is that through the brain studies, the neuroimaging, is that by phonological awareness training, it changes the patterns of brain activity. I'm not going to go into details because, well, I don't want to overwhelm you with details. But what we find is that in training children with phonological awareness, not only does it lead to gains in their reading scores, but it also leads to changes in their underlying brain activity. So these 3 points of evidence combined seem to show that phonological awareness plays a causal role in reading disabilities. So a lot of pop culture says that with reading disabilities, it's a visual issue. But what the research seems to be showing is that for most cases of reading disabilities, it's deficits in phonological awareness, whether it's in English or other languages, and that by training in phonological awareness, you can improve reading scores for most individuals with reading disabilities. So the implications for this comes for an emphasis in preventing reading disabilities. How many of you have heard the song Willoughby Wallaby Woo? Okay. I'm not going to make you sing it. But one of the things that happens before school entry, a way that you can help prevent reading disabilities, is playing with rhymes. There are a lot of nursery rhymes, rhyming songs for kids. So how many of you, so only one of you have seen it. So the song is like, Willoughby Wallaby Woo, an elephant sat on you. Willoughby Wallaby Wee, an elephant sat on me. And then to help build it with preschoolers, you might pull in their names, like Willoughby Wallaby Wary, an elephant sat on Harry, Gary, Mary, whatever, but Larry. So by being able to pull that in, pulling in their names with the rhymes and having them predict who will come up, young children really like hearing their own names thrown into songs, and building that with the rhyming in the songs helps build their sensitivity. So before school entry, things like nursery rhymes. Cross-culturally, rhyming is something that you find in so many different cultures, in so many songs, in so many word games with preschoolers. And that helps build their ear for the sounds. One of the things that you find in schools now is an increasing look at preventing reading disabilities, early screening. So you find in kindergarten that kids get screened on their letter knowledge as well as their phonological awareness, their ability to segment words into the individual sounds. So there's a phoneme segmentation task. It's a quick assessment, about a minute long, and children hear words like cat, and they have to repeat back the word cat in as many pieces as they can. So if a child repeats back cat as k-at, they'll get 2 points. If a child only repeats back the word cat in its entirety, they don't get any points. If they're able to do k-at, they'll get the 3 points. And they get as many words as they can in a minute. The higher the score, the lower the risk. And the school districts and the schools, they have different benchmarks for the beginning of kindergarten, middle of kindergarten, end of kindergarten. If children are below benchmark, then what's built into the curriculum, what you see schools increasingly do, is now start having children play more phonological awareness games, help build those skills. So by monitoring children's phonological awareness as early as kindergarten, you're able to prevent a lot of reading difficulties by being able to provide that intervention early on. I mentioned to you on the first day of class some of the work that I've done, some of the research that I've done. I was really lucky. For my postdoc, I worked with Linda Siegel, and she had this grant to work with a school district in Vancouver, Canada. And we screened all the kids in kindergarten 1 year, and we followed them. I was there until the end of first grade, and she continued following them through fourth, sixth grade. It was her grant. But one of the things that we found was that we shared the information with the teachers, even in the middle of kindergarten. And we said, these kids seem to be struggling, whether they're English learners or only English speakers. I'm using the sort of terminology that we find in public schools in California, English only or English learners. And what we did was we said that, we see that these kids seem to be struggling and they would benefit from phonological awareness training. And the school psychologists in that district actually developed a program, and some of the teachers developed their own program for phonological awareness training. And we followed the kids again at the end of the year, and then in first grade, and then she continued to follow them with reading comprehension second grade on. And what we found was that about a quarter of the English-only kids and a third of the English learners looked like they were at risk for reading difficulties in the middle of kindergarten. By the end of kindergarten, only 10% of the kids were performing below the 25th percentile on reading measures. So in other words, you would expect a quarter of the kids to be performing below the 25th percentile on national norms for beginning reading measures, and only 10% of the kids in this district, more than 1,000 kids. More than 1,000 kids in the district. There were about 1,200 kids that we tested in kindergarten. 10% of the English learners and the English-only kids were below benchmark. By the end of first grade, with continued phonological awareness training and phonics instruction, we found that only 5% of the kids were below the 25th percentile in measures of reading. And that was primarily because the teachers took the approach of, let's try and prevent reading difficulties and give intensive phonological awareness training. She looked at reading comprehension in second grade and found that about 3% of the kids were below the 25th percentile in measures of reading comprehension, not just decoding, not just word reading. And since we want them to be able to comprehend well, then that's really important in this prevention. Remember how we talked about the Matthew effects in the first week, or 2 weeks ago? When we talked about Matthew effects, if the kids find reading difficult, they check out and they don't like to practice, so it stays really hard. But if you do this prevention in kindergarten, in first grade, before the kids are really good at judging their own abilities, they don't tune out. They keep on reading, they practice, they don't find grade level materials too difficult. And so we actually saw in practice that phonological awareness training can reduce reading difficulties. Bless you.
Thank you.
So what's really critical in the primary grades is providing this intervention. Now, we're not saying that you only do phonological awareness, you only do phonics, and you forget meaning and comprehension. But if the kids can't figure out the words on the page, they're going to have a really hard time figuring out what the author's meanings are because you can't read the words on the page. What we find with kids with reading disabilities in the upper elementary grades is that children who aren't fluent with word reading, particularly if they're reading below a third grade level, they would benefit from phonological awareness training. If they're reading at or above a third grade level, then basically phonological awareness has done all that it's going to do for them, and instead we're going to look at morphological awareness, morphology and comprehension and building fluency. So the key thing, though, is that phonological awareness is critical, it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. They also need the phonics instruction, they need the fluency training, and they also need to develop the language skills. But you can prevent reading disabilities through intervention. So before we get into morphology, what I'd like to do is look a little bit at words and How many of you are familiar with the American Dialect Society? Okay, one of you. Okay, so one of the things that you'll see every January is the word of the year, and you'll probably see that like on Yahoo or Google, like with the Google News word of the year. Well, last year they had the word of the decade, which was Google. And Google was verb meaning to search the internet, generic form of the trademarked Google, the world's dominant internet search engine. Last year's word of the year was app, application program for a computer or phone operating system, as in there's an app for that, an advertising slogan for the iPhone. One of the useful runners-up was fat finger, which is the verb to mistype when your finger is too big. It's nice having little fingers at times. Accidentally striking more than one key on a keyboard or a pad. The reason why I want to draw your attention to morphology with these words of the year is because morphology is really important in the meaning. A morpheme is the smallest unit in a language that has meaning. And there are different ways that you can create new words. So with Google, what we see here is that the word Google was a trademark, a brand name, that's gone on to have a more general meaning. And it's become a verb. It's changed classes. With app, how did the word app come about? How do you think it was generated? Application, it's clipped. It's taken from the word application. For fat finger, the American Dialect Society also uses phrases that are used together. Fat finger, I don't think will really last that long, but it is kind of fun. What do you think here? Pardon me? There's alliteration happening there. What else do you notice? Remember, fat finger originated as an adjective and a noun, so it starts off as a noun phrase, and it's being used as a verb. So when we look at morphology, and we're going to be talking more on Thursday about different origins of words, what we're going to be looking at is parts of words, word meanings, how these are put together to make meaning. So with morphology, it's the study of meaningful units of language and how they're combined to form words. How many of you have heard the word prenup? So what's involved in prenup? How many parts are in prenup? 2 parts. There's the prefix, pre. What does that mean? Before. And nup. It's clipped from nuptial, and it also implies the agreement. So what you're able to do is, even though you might not have heard it before, you're able to infer its meaning by understanding the parts of words, its relationships to other words, and how they're put together. So a morpheme, as the textbook notes, there isn't a universal accepted definition of morpheme. So it's operationalized often as the smallest unit in language that contains a meaning. It can be a word, and words are the fundamental units of linguistic meaning. So a word may be made up of one morpheme, or it might be made up of multiple meanings. Sometimes a word is a single morpheme, like cat. Sometimes a word is made up of 2 morphemes, like cats. The s makes it plural, but you wouldn't have a standalone morpheme like s. You wouldn't have s indicating plural standing alone. So when we get to talking about words, we're going to just use some background sort of vocabulary terminology. So a lexicon refers to the list of words that we know. We might not be able to define all of them, but we might be familiar with some of them. We might have heard of these words before. But a lexicon is a list of words that we know. And some of the estimates are that by age of 17, the average person knows 80,000 words. That's a lot of words. And when we look at lexicons, there's been research that looks at the lexicon for bilingual and monolingual people. And that with young children and children who are bilingual, what we often find is that their lexicon in each language might be smaller than monolinguals in either language, but their combined lexicon could be as large or larger than monolinguals. When we talk about knowing words, there's a lot of information that we want to know. So when we talk about knowing a word, we want to talk about its phonological information. So what's the phonological information in the word cat? What do you think when we talk about the phonological information in a word we're talking about, such as cat? Uh-huh.
Are you talking about like the different sounds in the word?
Yep, we're talking about the sounds of the word. So when we know a word, we know its pronunciation. We know that we recognize k, a, t, cat. Even if we can't splice the individual sounds, the just sound stream for cat has some sort of meaning. How many of you have had that experience reading a word in a textbook, but not knowing what it actually sounds like? So you're lacking the phonological information. Then there's the morphological information. So with morphological information, that's the parts of the words, the meaningful words. So for the word cow dog, what are the morphemes in cow dog? Cow and dog. What do you think a cow dog is? Pardon me? A cow that looks like a dog? Well, it probably would be a dog that looks like a cow, or what would you say? Or a dog that works with cows. So that with English, the way that compounding works is that the second part of the compound word kind of gives you the meaning, and the first part of the compound gives you some sort of idea of the description. So the house dog would be different from a dog house. And this morphological information, it not only is the individual parts of the word, but it's how they're put together, the morphotactic rules, how we combine them. The semantic information deals with the meanings of words, the connotations, the denotation, so the explicit meaning, bless you, the connotations, how words are used. So with prejudice, what are the parts of prejudice for the morphemes involved? Pre, judge, and what's the suffix? Is. So there are three parts to it: the prefix, the root, and the suffix. What's the meaning of prejudice? If we want to look just at the denotative meaning, just the no connotations, no background information, just what's the straight meaning of prejudice? Yep.
Judging before you know.
Yep, judging before you know. And what are the connotations? How do we use it?
Negative.
It's a negative term. If you say that someone's prejudiced, then what you're saying is that you're judging other people either negatively or positively based on irrelevant features, whether it's age, whether it's sex, whether it's race, whether it's country of origin. So the semantic information also involves its relationship with other words and its meanings. We're going to look more at that when we talk about semantics. Then we also have pragmatic information about words, to know words. And with the pragmatic information, that's how do we use the words? What's the appropriate context for using the words? Knowing when it's sarcasm. How many of you have had parents who say, use your judgment? When you ask them if you can do something and they say, use your judgment. Don't you hate when they say that? My daughter hates it. But yeah, what does use your judgment mean? Does it mean do whatever you want and do what you think is right? What does it mean pragmatically? What is your parent saying? It's the, you know what the right choice is, you know what you should be doing, you know what I think. If you don't do it, then we could say it's your bad judgment. But I'm not going to tell you what's right or wrong, but you know. So there's a lot that's going on there. Another expression, whatever. Gosh, drives me nuts. Okay, so with the word knowledge, basically you have to know the sounds, knowing the structure of the words, the parts of the words, its meaning and how it's used. So the lexicon contains really rich information and the interconnection between these. And this all comes out when we use the dictionary. So let's consider the word baker. Isn't this a fun definition? Baker. You can't find baker in the dictionary very often. Instead, you find bake. Baked, baking, to cook, especially in an oven with dry heat, to harden and dry in or as if in an oven, like baked pottery. A social gathering in which baked foods are served. Baker, noun. If you didn't know what baker was, and you look this up, how useful is this definition going to be? If you understand morphology, if you understand what means in this context, it can be useful. If you don't know morphology, if you don't understand the what does mean in this case? One who bakes. Bless you. So if you know it's one who bakes, so that means it's someone who cooks, then it's useful. But if you don't understand morphology, then you won't necessarily have the tools to use the dictionary very effectively. So when we look at morphology and we're looking at words, there are different kinds of words. I've got the definition of morpheme down below because I just want to remind you. A simple word is one that can't be analyzed further. A simple word only has one morpheme. A complex word is one that has at least two morphemes. So cat is simple, cats is not. And when we look at morphology, there are ways of considering morphemes and categorizing them. So there are two main groups of morphemes, the free morphemes and the bound morphemes. The free morphemes are the morphemes that could function as words. They don't have to have any other morphemes attached to them to be meaningful. So the free morphemes are independent bases. They can serve as a base for a larger word, or you can use them by themselves. So what are examples of free morphemes? Let's hear them from you. Pardon me? I. Free morpheme. What else? Yep. You. What else? Yep. At. What else? Me. What else? Pre can't stand on its own. So it wouldn't be a free morpheme. You're hinting at the other class of morphemes. Important. It. Anything else? Us? My? Okay, what else? Pardon me? Free, elephant, spoon, banana. Those would all be examples of independent bases. They don't have to combine with others, but they can. So can you think of a combination with elephant? Elephants. See? You've added a bound morpheme to it. So with independent bases, you've already been hinting at the distinction between content words and function words. And the textbook does a really nice job discussing them. But content words are the words that carry a lot of meaning. They're the ones that kind of flow freely into and out of the language. So content words are words like elephant, or tree, or banana, or blue. So what kind of words are content words? Pardon me?
Noun.
So there are a lot of nouns. What else? Run, play, hop. Verbs, adjectives, adverbs. So these are words that contain a lot of meaning. The function words are words like I, and, what, where, this. The function words, they serve sort of as the glue in sentences. They help hold the meaning together. So with the free morphemes, we've got the function words and we also have the content words. But content words can also be made up of words that include bound morphemes. So bound morphemes are the chunks of words, the units of meaning, that can't stand alone. So we have bound roots. So let's use vest as an example. And I'm not talking about vest as in the article of clothing, but invest, divest, investigate. You've got that root. Nate, like neonate, national, nation. So the bound roots, you have some roots in words that just don't stand alone. They have to have prefixes and suffixes attached to them. These are the affixes. The affixes are made up of prefix and suffixes. So the affix, there's that ad from the Latin root, meaning attached. So the affixes are attached to the roots. It could be bound roots, or it could also be attached to independent bases. So you've got prevent, but you also have preview. What are some of the prefixes? Where do prefixes occur? At the beginning of the words. So what are some of the prefixes that kids learn? Pre. I know that clue is right in there. Dis. Miss. Yeah. So mistake. Disguise. Pardon me? Un. Un is a relatively easy one for the kids as well, like unhappy, unmake. They'll add that to other things, and it's okay when you're teaching the affixes to have made-up words. You could even make up words using the prefaces and the suffixes and have the kids kind of guess the meanings. How about replay, redo, resend. Then we have the suffixes. And the suffixes, we have two different categories, and we're going to be looking at those two categories in greater depth. We've got the prefixes, and we've got the inflectional endings, and we've got the derivational endings. So as a preview, the inflectional endings typically don't change the grammatical category of a word. So it can make something plural, like run, runs, as in I've got multiple runs in my stockings. You've got verbs. Oh gosh, I just thought. Again, run, runs. I run, he runs. The derivational suffixes are the ones that tend to change the grammatical categories of words, and we're going to be looking at them in greater depth. So we've got nation and national. Another form of a bound morpheme are the contracted forms. I'm, isn't, you're, as in you're happy. So the contracted forms is also something that can be challenging for kids in learning too. They might use them orally, but learning where to put that apostrophe can be really confusing for them. So those are the general categories of morphemes. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah?
What did you say that the derivational suffixes do?
They generally change the category, the grammatical category or class of a word.
Oh, okay.
So
like from a noun to like
from a noun to a verb,
okay.
yeah. Yeah. Okay. So when we have the inflectional ones, then basically what we do is we combine the stem or the root with an inflectional ending, a suffix. And it generally leads to a word of the same class. One of the things that it talks about is, you remember in school you talked about noun, verb, subject, verb agreement? Or agreement in terms of number? That's the general role of the inflectional endings in serving that sort of agreement. The derivational morphology, it generally leads to a new word of a different class. The meaning of the word might be a little challenging in predicting. You might have to know something about the new category. Some of them are easier than others. And we're going to look at them. So let's look at some examples over here. So the words with inflectional morphemes, what we find is that it can serve within the same grammatical, like to likes or birds to boards. So one function is for agreement in terms of number. These are relatively easy when we talk about these, because what happens is, does the root, the stem change? No. Bird goes straight to birds. So it's pretty easy for the kids. The meaning is still fairly transparent. What happens with nominal morphology is that the stem might change in some way or another. Or what happens is that the plural form might change. So when do we add the ES for the plural? Mm-hmm. So the plural form for bus, do we add another S right to the end? So it's bus with bus. No, we've got buses. So it does get confusing for children in learning that. Another thing that's really challenging for children is the irregular forms. And that's both with verbs and with nouns. So what's the plural for man? One of the things that we see with children, what's the most common mistake that they'll make once they learn the rule? Mans. Or goose. Gooses. It becomes unpredictable, and they have to straight out memorize them. Some of the mistakes that they might actually make with when they learn geese is geeses, or they'll say men's instead of men, because they've learned the rule. And children tend to develop sensitivity to morphology even before they develop that sensitivity to phonology. They're listening to meanings in words. What also happens in the plural forms, let's look, let's see. Plural forms, I'm thinking of verbs instead. I forgot to put that up there. Let's look at mass versus count nouns. There are different categories of nouns. When we talk about number, with mass nouns, we're talking about nouns that we can't say 3 cents. We're talking about things that it tends to happen in a group, a big clump. When we're talking about rain, there might be more rain, but we have to say more drops of rain or more raindrops, but we can't say there's more rain or less or many rain. With the count nouns, these are the ones that can be counted individually. We can count each individual items. This has meaning for whether or not we use few or many, few or less. So we could have less water, but we don't have few water. So with the count, the non-count, mass or non-count nouns versus the count nouns, that's a distinction that is important because it reflects the way that we describe them and make comparisons, the way that we think of them. For possessives, that also is another thing that children get very confused with when they're learning. How do we indicate that someone has something? So if we say Paula, that book belongs to Paula. It's Paula's, yeah. It's Paula's book. Kids get very confused with the apostrophe S. What we find is that once they learn one function for the apostrophe S, they kind of forget the other functions. So you'll find that first they're using it for contractions, then they're not using it for contractions, and they're just doing it for possessives. But those are the inflectional morphemes. The most intuitive, easiest to learn would be just the word stems combining with a grammatical ending. Different kinds of derivational morphemes. The simplest, again, is when you've got the root, the stem, combining with the grammatical morpheme. So bake becomes baker. Cook becomes cooker. Do becomes doer. Yeah?
For bake becoming baker, how do you teach children, like, don't put two B's, like they spell the word bake and then want to add?
They get practice with, a lot of it is practice at first. That's not as huge a mistake for the kids because they still, when they're learning to spell and learning it, they still are very heavily based on phonology. Yeah, so they tend not to make that mistake. Learning about hopper, learning about the doubling, that's more challenging for them. So, and we're going to talk about that next week when we talk about orthography and spelling. So We'll talk about that. And actually what we start seeing is the spelling instruction in kindergarten, first grade, second grade tends to be very phonologically based. What happens in third grade and beyond is that the spelling instruction then starts using morphology and emphasizing morphology and the word parts. They're introduced to morphology, particularly the prefixes and the inflectional endings in first and second grade. But when they hit third grade, that's when they start using the word structures, word families, morphological structures. So let's look at some examples of nominalizations. Nominalizations is when you change a verb into a noun. And one of the most common ones is using the I's. It depends on the kind of verbs. So realize becomes realization. Generalize becomes generalization. Digitize becomes digitization. So there is a little more systematicity than people assume when figuring out how to add the endings. And fortunately, people tend to be pretty sensitive to the statistical co-occurrences in language. They tend to notice, even though they might not be consciously aware of it, but they tend to notice that the I's verbs becomes Asians. Nationalize, nationalization. Similarly, with verbs adding the now makes it nouns. So murder becomes murderer, spell becomes speller. What do we notice about these nouns? Baker, painter, fixer. What can we say about these nouns? What does the inflectional ending, not inflectional, derivational ending, the derivational suffix mean? One who. So the murderer is one who murders. Gosh, that's not a very nice example now that I'm thinking of it. Speller, one who spells. Baker, one who bakes. Doer, one who does. What can we say about the isation one? Generalize, generalization. Realize, realization.
It's the act of doing
Yep, it's the act of doing this process. So digitalize, you're making something digital, changing it from analog to digital. So what we see is that these endings, they convey a lot of meaning to the words, and it is useful to teach this sort of structural analysis to children, not just for spelling, but also for getting the meanings of unfamiliar words. If you come across an unfamiliar word and seeing that it's got the Asian ending, nationalization, the process of becoming a nation. So it gives you insight into and hints and clues into what the word means. So let's look at some of the ones that change verbs and nouns into adjectives. Embrace, embraceable. Pity, pitiable. What does the able mean? Love, lovable. Detestable. Mm-hmm.
It means like that person embodies whatever that word that you're using to describe them.
Yeah, that you can do that to the person. So tormentable. My daughter thinks I'm very tormentable. She likes to torture me. But yeah, so you know that pitiable is that this is an object of pity. Embraceable, this is an object you can embrace. Torment, this is an object or a person you can torment. So we've got care and wit going to careless, witless, clueless. What does the less ending mean? Without, yeah. So we've got careless without a care, witless without a wit. Not very bright, not very witty. How about clueless? Without a clue, you don't know what's going on there. So again, the thing to keep in mind is that there is systematicity. These endings, they do convey meaning in how they're combined. You can also change adjectives to adverbs, such as happy to happily, slow to slowly, quick to quickly, reluctant to reluctantly. So what does it mean? Yep, it describes how the action is done. Is it happily? Is it reluctant? Is it slow? Is it quick? The examples that I've given you so far have primarily been relatively simple, but there are more complicated ones that it's harder for children to notice the relations, and that's when it changes the pronunciations. So, less, scienceless, concernless, goable, steepable, those don't really work so well, do they? The other thing also is that some of the meanings are hard to predict just by the rule. So clueless, what does that mean? Without a clue. Careless, without a care. Nerveless. Right, but when we say that someone doesn't have the nerve to do something, it means they can't do it. But if someone's nerveless, it's like they've got nerves of steel. So what we find is that with the derivational suffixes, it's a good rule of thumb for inferring the meanings, but it doesn't always work. So when we get back to the idea of instruction, like you had, it's important for kids not just to see when it works, but they also have to see examples that it doesn't work. You want to introduce it to children with it working. And then you want to say, okay, it works most of the time, but sometimes it doesn't work. And here are some examples of when it doesn't work. So let's go through these. Does clueless work? Yeah, it means without a clue. Does careless work? Yeah, it means without a care. You're not being careful. Does nerveless work? Well, actually, it means that you're super gutsy, super nervy. So it doesn't work in this situation. Does that make sense to you? When kids are aware that it sometimes doesn't work, they're much more resilient when they come across non-examples. So what I've done for you is I've put together some examples of changing verbs or adjectives to nouns. So you see the process with computerized to computerization. We've got appoint to appointee. So what's an appointee?
Someone appointed.
Right. So someone who has been appointed. So what would you find an appointee, how would an appointee be different than an appointer?
The appointer does the appointing.
Exactly. So, yeah. So, hug. Who's the hugger? The one who's giving the hugs. Who's the huggee? The person getting squished with the hug, yeah. So we see that there are subtle differences in these that convey a lot of meaning, and being familiar with these patterns is useful. You don't want to introduce all of them to children at the same time. So, for example, which ending, the ation, the double E like appointee, or the are you going to want to introduce to children first? Because they come across that the most frequently. That they're already using in familiar language. And once they learn that pattern explicitly, then they'll overgeneralize. It's really kind of neat to see them turning everything into an Which one do you think would come next? The E. The E kind of, they're used to the passive. They start using passive in third grade in their spontaneous language. The other reason for that is that the I's, they don't come across that verb as frequently. They don't come across that inflection and that suffix, the I's suffix, as frequently in the younger grades. How about ness? like fuzziness. It changes adjectives. So ness typically is, let's delete that. I didn't want the phone to ring. So going from an adjective to a ness, fuzziness. What does the ness mean? It's a noun. And what does it mean, that kind of noun? Fuzziness, or happiness, or sadness, or playfulness. Yeah, it's a state, the state of being playful, the state of being fuzzy, the state of being happy, the state of being sad. It's the condition. So those would be examples that you see with all these different endings, all these different suffixes. They do have different meanings applied to them. Similarly, you can change nouns and verbs to adjectives. So computation, computational. Confrontation, confrontational. Exception, exceptional. What does the all mean in these situations? Mm-hmm. Yep, it characterizes a person or a thing. So the computational, it can refer to a process, and it's like this process reflects this noun. How about the able? So with the verbs, embrace, embraceable. Mm-hmm. Kiss, kissable. Like, likable. Detest, detestable. You change the verbs and you say that this adjective, well, this verb describes the person, what you can do to that object. Similarly, we talked about the less. That typically means not having the noun. Okay, what I'd like to do is, in your tables, what I'd like you to do is to try and identify different kinds of morphemes there. So what I want each group to do is to spend some time going through the first couple of Jabberwocky, identify a couple of function words, a couple content words, identify some words you think are verbs and explain why, words that you think are nouns and why, and adjectives and why you think they're that. So I think that for the video, since we could probably end the video now because we're just going to be doing group work and it will be kind of boring for anyone watching this. But what we'll do is we'll spend time in your groups and your tables, and I want you to each identify the different kinds of morphemes. And what you'll find is when we get to our discussion of syntax and grammar, you'll find that our discussion of morpheme and this exercise will actually help you, because looking at morphology can help you identify the class of words, if it's verbs or nouns. So look for contractions, look for function words, look for content words, look for nouns and why you say they're nouns, verbs and why you say they're verbs, and adjectives. And when you pick those classes of words, I don't want you to pick words like did in terms of did is a verb. Yes, we know it's a verb. But let's look at some of the other words there and why you think that they might be. Great. So I'll give you time to work together and we'll take it up in 7 minutes. We'll split the rest of the time between that. Yes, please. So that way you'll be able to see, did I get it or didn't I? Main reason why I want you to have this practice in class is because something for the midterm, it is quite possible that you'll have to justify why different words are different classes of words, reflecting on derivational morphology or inflectional morphology. So the midterm, we will have review time before the midterm, but I do want you to be able to apply these principles to real words. And please, I like hearing discussion. I like hearing groups talking. Thank you.